The town of Ferndale, Ohio sits tucked between rolling farmland and dense forest, the kind of place where everyone knows your name before you finish introducing yourself. Population 3,847. One high school. 2 churches. 3 bars. The sort of community where doors stayed unlocked and children rode their bikes until the streetlights flickered on, painting the sidewalks in pools of amber glow. It was the kind of town where nothing ever happened. Until October 14th, 1989, when everything changed. That Saturday began like any other autumn morning. Leaves tumbled across front yards in shades of rust and gold. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and approaching rain. Families gathered for weekend breakfasts, made plans for apple picking, debated whether it was too early to start thinking about Halloween costumes. At the Miller household on Sycamore Drive, 16-year-old Emily Miller woke just after 9 in the morning. Her mother, Janet, was already downstairs preparing pancakes. Her father, Robert, sat at the kitchen table with the newspaper spread before him, reading about the Berlin Wall and drinking black coffee from his favorite mug. Her younger brother, Danny, 8 years old, was planted in front of the television watching cartoons. Normal, ordinary, forgettable. Emily came downstairs in jeans and an oversized sweater, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Janet would later remember every detail of that morning with crystalline clarity, the kind of painful precision that only trauma can etch into memory. The way Emily had smiled when she grabbed a pancake off the plate, the way she had laughed at something Danny said, and the way she had kissed her mother on the cheek before heading out the door. Emily told her parents she was going to meet her best friend, Lisa Hoffman, at the public library. They were working on a history project together, something about World War II. She would be home by dinner, 5 o'clock at the latest. She promised. Janet Miller watched her daughter walk down Sycamore Drive, backpack slung over one shoulder, sneakers scuffing against the pavement. She watched until Emily turned the corner onto Maple Street and disappeared from view. That was the last time anyone who loved Emily Miller would ever see her alive. When 5 o'clock came and went with no sign of Emily, Janet felt the first flutter of concern in her chest. By 5:30, that flutter had grown into something harder, something with teeth. She called the Hoffman residence. Lisa answered on the 3rd ring. "No," Lisa said, confusion clear in her voice. Emily never showed up at the library. Lisa had waited for 45 minutes before giving up and going home. She thought maybe Emily had gotten sick or changed her mind. Janet's hands began to shake as she hung up the phone. Robert called the library directly. The librarian on duty, Mrs. Patterson, confirmed what Lisa had said. She had not seen Emily Miller that day. Not at all. Not at all. By 6 o'clock, Robert Miller was in his car, driving the route Emily would have taken. Sycamore to Maple. Maple to Bridgeport. Bridgeport to Main Street where the library stood. Less than a mile in total. A 15-minute walk at most. He drove it 3 times, eyes scanning sidewalks and yards, searching for any trace of his daughter. He found nothing. No backpack. No torn piece of clothing. No sign that Emily had ever walked that route at all. At 6:45, Robert Miller called the Ferndale Police Department. Chief Raymond Calloway took the call himself. A missing teenager was serious business, especially in a town where the most exciting thing that usually happened was someone's tractor breaking down during harvest season. But teenagers were also unpredictable creatures. They fought with their parents. They ran off with boyfriends. They made impulsive decisions. Still, Calloway told Robert to come down to the station. They would start looking right away. Within an hour, half the town knew that Emily Miller was missing. This was 1989. No Facebook. No Twitter. No mass text messages. Word spread the old-fashioned way, through phone calls and conversations at the grocery store, through worried whispers at the gas station and the diner. By nightfall, search parties had formed. Volunteers combed the streets with flashlights, calling Emily's name into the darkness. They checked the park. They checked the woods behind the elementary school. They checked the banks of Willow Creek, where teenagers sometimes gathered to smoke cigarettes and drink cheap beer stolen from their parents' garages. They found nothing. The next morning, Sunday, the search expanded. Police officers from neighboring towns arrived to help. Bloodhounds were brought in, given Emily's scent from a pillowcase on her bed. The dogs led searchers to Maple Street, then seemed to lose the trail completely near the intersection with Bridgeport Avenue. It was as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation kicked into high gear. The police interviewed everyone who knew Emily: friends, teachers, neighbors, the boy she had dated briefly last spring before they broke up amicably, the family who lived across the street, the mailman who delivered on Sycamore Drive. The son, Waitu, everyone told the same story. Emily was a good kid, responsible, not the type to run away, not the type to get into trouble. She had plans for the future. She wanted to go to college, maybe study veterinary medicine. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. She made honor roll every semester. There was no reason for her to disappear, but she had. The local newspaper, the Ferndale Gazette, ran Emily's photo on the front page. Missing. Last seen Saturday morning. If you have any information, please contact the police. Her school photographs stared out from every newspaper box in town, her smile frozen in time, unaware of what was coming. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The searches continued, but with less frequency. The volunteers grew tired. Life demanded their attention. Bills needed paying. Jobs needed working. Children needed raising. Slowly, inevitably, the town began to move on. But Janet and Robert Miller could not move on. Would not move on. Their daughter was somewhere. Dead or alive, she was somewhere. And they needed to know where. The case went cold. By 1990, the investigation had stalled completely. No witnesses, no physical evidence, no ransom demands, no body. Emily Miller had walked out of her house on an ordinary Saturday morning and had been swallowed by something dark and terrible, something that left no trace behind. Theories circulated. Maybe she had been picked up by a stranger, someone passing through town. Maybe she had been abducted by someone local, someone who had watched her and waited for the perfect moment. Maybe she had run away after all, despite what everyone said, and was living a new life somewhere far away. Maybe. The word haunted the Miller family like a ghost. Robert threw himself into the investigation with the obsession of a man who had nothing left to lose. He made copies of Emily's missing poster and drove to every town within 100 miles, tacking them to telephone poles and bulletin boards. He called the FBI. He hired a private investigator who took his money and produced nothing useful. He spent hours in the library poring over articles about other missing girls, looking for patterns, for connections, for anything that might bring Emily home. Janet retreated inward. She kept Emily's room exactly as it had been. The bed made. The stuffed animals arranged on the pillows. The posters on the walls. She would sit in there for hours, just sitting, just breathing the air that Emily had once breathed, as if proximity to her daughter's possessions could somehow bring her back. Danny, now 9 years old, watched his parents crumble. He watched his father become a hollow-eyed stranger who barely slept. He watched his mother fade into a ghost who moved through the house in silence. He felt invisible in his own home, his grief unnoticed, his fear unspoken. The town of Ferndale tried to forget. It was too painful to remember, too frightening to acknowledge that a girl could vanish without explanation, without justice, without resolution. But some things refused to stay buried. 15 years passed. The calendar turned from 1989 to 2004. The world changed in ways both large and small. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. The internet became a household fixture. Cell phones grew smaller and smarter. The new millennium arrived with fireworks and champagne and fear of computers failing worldwide. Ferndale changed too, though not as dramatically. The population grew slightly. A few new businesses opened. The high school got a renovation. But at its core, the town remained the same. Quiet, safe, predictable. Emily Miller became a cautionary tale told to children. Do not talk to strangers. Do not walk alone. Do not trust everyone who smiles at you. Her missing posters faded in the sun, eventually removed and replaced with advertisements for yard sales and lost dogs. Janet and Robert Miller aged in the way that grief ages people. Robert's hair turned white. Janet developed a tremor in her hands. Danny grew up and moved away for college, unable to bear the suffocating weight of a house haunted by his sister's absence. The case remained open, technically, but no one was actively working on it anymore. Emily Miller was filed away with hundreds of other cold cases, her file gathering dust in a basement storage room at the police station. Until March 8, 2004, when something impossible happened. Ferndale Elementary School still stood on the same plot of land it had occupied for 70 years, a brick building with tall windows and a playground out back. Inside one of the second-grade classrooms, a teacher named Monica Pruitt was conducting art time. 23 children sat at tables with construction paper, crayons, markers, and glue sticks scattered before them. The assignment was simple. Draw a picture of something you saw outside. A tree, a cloud, a bird, anything. Most of the children drew predictable things. Flowers, houses, the sun with rays shooting out like spokes on a wheel. But one child, a 7-year-old girl named Kayla Brennan, drew something different. Monica noticed it when she walked past Kayla's table. The drawing showed a forest rendered in dark greens and browns, trees with thick trunks and sprawling branches, and standing among those trees, partially hidden, was a figure, a girl. The girl. She was drawn in profile, her features rough but recognizable. Long hair, a sweater, jeans. She stood very still, hands at her sides, staring out from between the trees with an expression that Monica could not quite identify. Monica crouched beside Kayla's desk. That's a very interesting drawing, sweetie. Can you tell me about it? Kayla looked up with wide brown eyes. She spoke matter-of-factly, the way children do when relating something they believe to be simple truth. That's the girl who lives in the trees. I see her sometimes when we drive past the forest. Monica felt something cold slide down her spine. But what do you mean, the girl who lives in the trees? Kayla pointed at the figure in her drawing. She stands there and watches. She doesn't move. She just watches. Monica forced a smile. And where exactly do you see her? On Highway 52. Near the old farm. Mommy says it's abandoned. Highway 52 ran along the eastern edge of Ferndale, cutting through farmland and forest. The old farm Kayla mentioned was the Hutchins property, a plot of land that had been empty for decades after the family moved away and the barn collapsed in a storm. Monica told Kayla her drawing was very creative and moved on to the next student. But she could not shake the image from her mind. The girl standing in the trees, watching. After school ended, Monica Pruitt did something she would later struggle to explain. She drove out to Highway 52. The abandoned Hutchins farm sat about 6 miles outside of town, marked by a rusted mailbox and a gravel driveway choked with weeds. The barn was indeed collapsed, just a heap of rotting wood and corrugated metal. The house still stood but barely, its windows broken, its porch sagging. Behind the property, dense forest stretched for miles. Monica parked her car on the shoulder of the highway and stared into those trees. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches, creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted in the breeze. She saw nothing unusual. No girl, no figure, just trees and undergrowth and the quiet rustle of leaves. She told herself she was being ridiculous. It was just a child's drawing. Kids had vivid imaginations, and they saw faces in clouds and monsters in shadows. But as Monica sat there in her car, staring into the forest, she remembered something she had not thought about in years. Emily Miller. Me. Miller. Worcesters. Monica had been in high school when Emily disappeared. She remembered the posters, the search parties, The way fear had settled over Ferndale like a heavy blanket. She remembered Emily's face, dark blonde hair, a bright smile. Monica looked down at the drawing sitting on her passenger seat, and the figure in the trees. Long hair, a sweater, jeans, her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She drove back to town and went directly to the police station. The officer at the front desk listened to Monica's story with polite skepticism. A second grader drew a picture of a girl in the woods. Yes, and what exactly did Monica expect them to do about it? Monica felt foolish explaining herself. It sounded absurd even to her own ears. But something in her gut insisted this mattered. And the officer took the drawing and promised to pass it along to someone. Monica went home and tried to forget about it. But the following week, she received a phone call, and the man on the other end identified himself as Detective Alan Price. He had recently transferred to Ferndale from Cincinnati and had been assigned to review cold cases. Emily Miller's case was on his desk. Could he come by and speak with Monica about the drawing? They met at a coffee shop on Main Street. Detective Price was in his early 40s, with tired eyes and the careful manner of someone who had seen too much darkness in his career. He thanked Monica for coming and slid the drawing across the table. "Tell me everything," he said. Monica repeated the story. Kayla Brennan's drawing, her comment about the girl who lives in the trees, the location on Highway 52. Price listened without interrupting. When Monica finished, he pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it. Inside were photographs, crime scene photos, missing person reports, and a school photograph of Emily Miller. Price placed it beside Kayla's drawing. The resemblance was unmistakable. Monica's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God." Price leaned back in his chair. "I spoke with Kayla Brennan yesterday, with her parents present, of course. I asked her to describe the girl she sees. She said the girl has yellow hair, that she wears a big shirt, that she stands very still and never moves. Emily Miller had blonde hair. She had been wearing an oversized sweater the day she disappeared." "I want to search the area," Price said. "But I need more than a child's drawing to justify pulling resources. I need something concrete." Monica stared at the photograph of Emily, 16 years old, smiling, unaware that she had only hours left. "What do you need me to do?" Monica asked. Price met her eyes. "I need you to take me to the exact spot where Kayla says she sees the girl." 2 days later, Monica Pruitt and Detective Alan Price stood on the shoulder of Highway 52, staring into the forest behind the abandoned Hutchins farm. Price had brought a junior officer with him, a young man named Todd Mercer who looked nervous and out of his depth. They had flashlights despite it being midday, and they had cameras. They had evidence bags. What they did not have was any idea what they were looking for. Price turned to Monica. "Show me where." Monica pointed into the trees. Kayla said it's about 20 or 30 feet in, near a big oak tree with a split trunk. They entered the forest. The temperature dropped immediately beneath the canopy. The air smelled of damp earth and rotting leaves. Their footsteps crunched on fallen branches. Birds called overhead, their voices echoing. Monica spotted the oak tree first. Split trunk, exactly as Kayla had described. Price approached slowly, his eyes scanning the ground. And then he stopped. "They're done." He stopped. "Todd," he said quietly, "call it in." Monica moved closer and saw what Price had seen. Half buried in leaves and soil, barely visible, was a scrap of fabric. Faded, dirty, but unmistakably part of a sweater. Price crouched and carefully brushed away the debris. At least beneath the fabric, barely 3 inches down, was bone, and the forest became a crime scene within hours. Yellow tape stretched between trees, cordoning off an area roughly 50 feet in diameter. Police vehicles lined Highway 52, their lights painting the afternoon in alternating flashes of red and blue. Officers moved through the underbrush with careful deliberation, their boots crunching over 15 years of accumulated leaves and decay. Detective Alan Price stood beside the split oak tree and watched the forensic team work. They had brought ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, photographers who documented every inch of disturbed soil, and the scrap of fabric had been bagged and tagged. The bone fragment had been carefully excavated and placed in an evidence container, but Price knew they would find more. He could feel it in the weight of the air, in the way the forest seemed to hold its breath around them. This place had kept a secret for 15 years. Now that secret was clawing its way back to the surface. By nightfall, portable lights had been erected, turning the forest into a stage illuminated against the darkness. The excavation continued. Soil was removed one careful layer at a time, sifted through screens, examined for any trace of evidence. But at 11:37 that evening, one of the forensic technicians called out, and they had found a skull. Price approached the excavation site and looked down into the shallow grave. Even partially uncovered, even after 15 years in the ground, the shape was unmistakable. Human remains, female, young. He stepped back and pulled out his phone. The call he was about to make would destroy what remained of the Miller family. But they deserved to know. After 15 years of not knowing, they deserved the truth, no matter how terrible. Robert Miller answered on the second ring. His voice was thick with sleep and confusion. Price identified himself and asked if Robert was sitting down. "We found something," Price said quietly. "We found remains. Mazer, we found remains." The sound Robert Miller made was not quite a sob, not quite a scream. It was something worse, something that came from a place beyond language, beyond rational thought. Price waited. Mondays, Rome. When Robert could speak again, his voice was barely a whisper. "Is it her? Is it Emily?" "We won't know for certain until we complete forensic analysis," Price said. "But the location matches. The clothing matches. I think you should prepare yourself." Robert Miller hung up without another word. Price stood in the forest with the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to dead air, and felt the weight of this case settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. The excavation continued through the night. By morning, the remains had been fully uncovered. A complete skeleton. Scraps of clothing still clinging to the bones. Deteriorated sneakers on the feet. A backpack, rotted and collapsed, lying nearby. Inside the backpack, they found a notebook. The pages were water-damaged and illegible, but the name written on the cover in faded ink was still visible. The Emily Miller. Then there, and the news spread through Ferndale like wildfire. They had found her. After 15 years, after countless searches. After thousands of hours of investigation and heartbreak and unanswered questions, Emily Miller had been less than 7 miles from home the entire time. The Ferndale Gazette ran the story on the front page. Emily Miller found. Remains discovered in forest off Highway 52. The article was respectful but thorough, recounting the circumstances of her disappearance, the failed investigation, and the bizarre twist that had led to her discovery. The second-grade drawing. A child who claimed to see a girl standing in the trees. The town reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. A relief that the Miller family finally had answers. The horror at where those answers had led. Janet Miller collapsed when Robert told her the news. She was taken to Ferndale General Hospital, where doctors treated her for shock and kept her overnight for observation. Robert sat beside her bed and held her hand and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. Danny Miller drove home from Columbus the moment he heard. He arrived to find his childhood home surrounded by news vans and reporters shouting questions. He pushed through them without responding and locked the door behind him. The house felt like a mausoleum. Emily's room was still preserved exactly as it had been. The bed made, the stuffed animals arranged, and the posters yellowed with age. Danny stood in the doorway and looked at the shrine his mother had maintained for 15 years and felt something crack open inside his chest. His sister was dead, had been dead this entire time, while he graduated high school, while he went to college, while he fell in love and broke up and fell in love again, while he built a life. Emily had been lying in the ground, alone in the dark. The autopsy was performed at the county medical examiner's office. The pathologist assigned to the case was a woman named Dr. Valerie Hutchinson, no relation to the family who had once owned the farm where Emily was found. She had performed hundreds of autopsies during her 20-year career. She had seen bodies in every imaginable state of decomposition. But examining the remains of a 16-year-old girl who had been missing for 15 years was different. Dr. Hutchinson worked methodically, documenting every detail. The bones showed signs of animal activity, which was expected given the shallow burial and the passage of time. But beneath that damage, other injuries were visible: fractures to the skull, defensive wounds on the forearms, damage to the hyoid bone in the neck. Emily Miller had been murdered. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the head combined with strangulation. The manner of death was homicide. Dr. Hutchinson completed her report and sent it to Detective Price along with DNA confirmation. The remains were definitively those of Emily Ann Miller, age 16, missing since October 14, 1989. Price read the report 3 times, committing every detail to memory. Then he went back to work. The investigation exploded into motion with renewed urgency. This was no longer a cold case about a missing girl. This was an active homicide investigation. Price pulled the original case files and spread them across his desk. Witness statements, interview transcripts, taking photos of the search efforts. He read everything, looking for something that had been missed, some detail that might point to a suspect. The problem was simple and infuriating. In 1989, the investigation had focused on the route between Emily's house and the library. No one had thought to search the forest near the abandoned Hutchins farm. Why would they? There was no reason for Emily to be out there. No connection between her and that location. But someone had known about that place. Someone had chosen it specifically. Price created a timeline. Emily left her house at approximately 9:15 on Saturday, October 14, 1989. She was supposed to meet her friend at the library, a walk that should have taken no more than 15 minutes. But she never arrived. Somewhere between Sycamore Drive and Main Street, something happened. Did someone grab her off the street in broad daylight? Unlikely in a town where everyone knew everyone. Someone would have seen. Someone would have reported it. Did someone she knew offer her a ride? More plausible. Emily would have trusted someone familiar, that she would have gotten into their car without hesitation. Price made a list of everyone who had been interviewed in 1989. The family members, friends, neighbors, teachers. He cross-referenced that list with vehicle registrations from the time period, looking for anyone who owned a car or truck. The list was discouragingly long. Then Price had another thought. The Hutchins farm. Why that location specifically? He pulled records on the property. The Hutchins family had moved away in 1979 after their barn collapsed. The land had been for sale for years but had no buyers. It was too remote, too run down, too expensive to restore. But someone had known about it. Someone had known the forest behind the property would provide cover. Price drove out to Highway 52 and stood where Emily's remains had been found. The split oak tree, the shallow grave. He turned in a slow circle, surveying the surrounding area. From this spot, the highway was barely visible through the trees. You could hear cars passing but not see them clearly. It was isolated, private. The perfect place to hide a body, and the perfect place to hide something else. Price called in a larger search team. If Emily had been buried here, there might be other evidence nearby. Personal effects, weapon fragments, tire tracks, though after 15 years those would be long gone. The team returned to the forest with metal detectors and more ground-penetrating radar. They expanded the search radius to 100 yards in every direction from the grave site. On the third day of searching, they found something. Buried approximately 30 feet from where Emily had been found, wrapped in a deteriorated plastic bag, was a piece of jewelry. A class ring. Ferndale High School. Class of 1986. The name engraved on the inside was still legible. Trevor Maines. Maines. Price felt electricity shoot through his body. He returned to the station and pulled records on Trevor Maines. Born in Ferndale in 1968, graduated from Ferndale High School in 1986, worked at his father's auto repair shop on the edge of town. Price checked the original case files from 1989. Trevor Maines had been interviewed. Briefly, he had told police he barely knew Emily Miller. She was just some kid. He had been at work the day she disappeared. His father confirmed the alibi. The interview had lasted less than 20 minutes. Price dug deeper. Trevor Maines still lived in Ferndale, still worked at the auto repair shop, which he now owned after his father retired. He'd never married. No criminal record beyond a DUI in 1992. Price drove to Maines Auto Repair just after 3 in the afternoon. The shop sat on a dusty lot surrounded by chain-link fence. Inside the open garage bay, a man in grease-stained coveralls was bent over the engine of a pickup truck. Price approached slowly. Trevor Maines? The man straightened and turned. He was in his mid-30s now, carrying extra weight around his middle, his hair thinning. His eyes were wary. "Yeah, who's asking?" Price showed his badge. "Detective Alan Price. I'd like to ask you a few questions about Emily Miller." Something flickered across Maines' face. Fear, guilt, recognition. He wiped his hands on a rag. "I already talked to the police about that. Long time ago." "I know," Price said calmly. "But we found her. We found Emily. And we found something else." Price pulled out a photograph of the class ring, still in its evidence bag. Maines stared at the image. His face went pale. "That's your ring, isn't it?" Price said. "Your class ring. We found it buried near Emily's body. Can you explain how it got there?" Maines opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. "I lost that ring. Years ago. I don't know how it ended up there. You lost it near the exact spot where Emily Miller was buried." "I'm telling you I lost it. I don't know nothing about what happened to that girl." Price stepped closer. "Then you won't mind coming down to the station to provide a formal statement and a DNA sample. Just to clear things up." Maines' eyes darted toward the fence, toward the street beyond, calculating distances and possibilities. Price saw it coming before it happened. Maines bolted. He ran for the back of the shop, crashed through a door, and sprinted across the lot behind the building. Price pursued, radio already in hand, calling for backup. Maines had a head start, but Price was faster. They tore through backyards and alleys, Maines gasping for breath, Price gaining ground. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Maines made it 3 blocks before Price tackled him to the ground behind the Baptist church. They struggled. Maines threw a wild punch that connected with Price's jaw, but Price recovered and pinned him face down in the grass, wrenching his arms behind his back. "Trevor Maines, you are under arrest," Price said, snapping handcuffs into place. Maines was sobbing. "I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to. It was an accident." Price hauled him to his feet as patrol cars screeched to a halt in the church parking lot. Trevor Maines was transported to the police station and placed in an interrogation room. Price let him sit there for an hour, stewing in his own panic, before entering with a digital recorder and a folder full of evidence photographs. Price read Maines his rights. Then he sat down across the table and waited. Maines looked at his hands. At the table, and at anything except Price's face. "Tell me what happened," Price said quietly. "Tell me about Emily." And Trevor Maines broke. The confession poured out of him like poison finally released. He had been 21 years old in 1989, working at his father's shop, living in a trailer on the outskirts of town, drinking too much, angry at the world for reasons he could not articulate. He had seen Emily Miller walking along Maple Street that Saturday morning. Pretty girl. Young. Alone. He had pulled over and offered her a ride. Told her he knew her father, that he could drop her at the library. Emily had hesitated but ultimately accepted. It was Ferndale. Everyone knew everyone. Why would she suspect danger? Maines drove past the library. When Emily questioned him, he told her he needed to make a quick stop first. He turned onto Highway 52. Emily grew nervous, asked him to take her back. Said she wanted to get out. Maines refused. They argued. Emily tried to open the door while the truck was moving. Maines grabbed her, pulled over onto the shoulder near the Hutchins farm. Emily fought, scratched his face, screamed. Maines panicked. He hit her, once, then again, harder. He did not remember how many times. When he realized she was not breathing, he dragged her body into the forest. Dug a shallow grave with a shovel he kept in his truck bed. Buried her beneath the split oak tree. Then he went home and tried to forget. But you cannot forget something like that. And the guilt festered. The fear grew. Every time a police car passed. Every time someone mentioned Emily's name. Every time he closed his eyes. For 15 years he lived in terror of being caught, and now he had been. Price listened to the entire confession without interrupting. When Maines finished, Price asked one question. Why did you bury your class ring with her? Maines looked confused. I didn't. I told you I lost that ring. You lost it in the exact spot where you buried Emily's body. Maines shook his head. It must have fallen off. When I was digging. I didn't notice. I swear I didn't know it was there. Price studied him. Maines was telling the truth about that part at least. The ring had been an accident. A piece of evidence left behind without his knowledge. One mistake in a lifetime of mistakes. Trevor Maines was formally charged with the murder of Emily Ann Miller. The prosecutor's office announced they would be seeking life in prison without the possibility of parole. The town of Ferndale reacted with shock and rage. Trevor Maines had lived among them for 15 years after killing Emily, had repaired their cars, had smiled and made small talk, had pretended to be normal. Janet Miller was released from the hospital and returned home. Robert held her while she wept, 15 years of grief finally finding release. Danny stood in Emily's room and said goodbye to the sister he had lost twice, once when she disappeared and again when they found her. The funeral was held on a Tuesday in late March. The entire town attended. Emily Miller was laid to rest in Ferndale Cemetery beneath a headstone that read, "Beloved daughter and sister, gone but never forgotten." Detective Alan Price attended the service and stood at the back, watching the Miller family say their final goodbye. After the burial, Monica Pruitt approached him. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Monica asked. Price considered the question. "I don't know. I hope so. I hope so." Monica looked toward the grave where flowers were piled high. "What about Kayla, the little girl who drew the picture? She said she saw Emily standing in the trees. How do you explain that?" Price had no answer. The rational part of his mind said it was coincidence. Children had vivid imaginations. Kayla had probably seen something ordinary, a trick of light and shadow, and her mind had filled in the rest. But another part of him, the part that had worked enough cases to know the world was stranger than it appeared, wondered. What if Emily had been standing there? What if some part of her had remained, waiting to be found, waiting to lead someone to the truth? He kept that thought to himself. On the trial of Trevor Maines took place 8 months later. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession, the DNA match, the class ring, the autopsy findings. The defense attorney tried to argue for a lesser charge, claiming it had been an accident, a moment of panic rather than premeditated murder. And the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty and guilty. Trevor Maines was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He was led from the courtroom in shackles while the Miller family watched. Janet cried quietly. Robert sat stone-faced. Danny looked at the man who had killed his sister and felt nothing but emptiness. Justice had been served, but it did not bring Emily back. Years passed. The Miller family tried to rebuild their lives. Janet returned to volunteering at the animal shelter, the place Emily had loved. Robert retired and spent his days tending a garden, finding peace in the simple act of making things grow. Danny married and had a daughter of his own, a little girl with dark blonde hair who he named Emma, close enough to Emily to honor her memory without burdening the child with the weight of the past. Ferndale moved forward. The auto repair shop was sold. The forest where Emily had been found became a place people avoided, a scar on the landscape that time would eventually heal but never erase. And sometimes, on quiet mornings when mist hung low over Highway 52, the drivers passing the old Hutchins farm would glance toward the trees and swear they saw someone standing there, a girl in an oversized sweater, watching, waiting. Waiters moaned, waiting, but when they looked again, she was gone. Detective Alan Price retired from the police force in 2019 after 30 years of service. The Emily Miller case remained the one he thought about most often, the case that had been solved not through brilliant detective work or modern forensics, but through the innocent drawing of a 7-year-old child. He kept a copy of that drawing in his home office, framed on the wall beside his commendations and awards. A reminder that sometimes the truth comes from the most unexpected places. On the 15th anniversary of Emily's reburial, Price drove out to Ferndale Cemetery. He had not been back since the funeral. He found her headstone easily, still maintained, still covered in fresh flowers. He stood there for a long time, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Then he heard footsteps behind him. Janet Miller approached, older now but carrying herself with quiet strength. She smiled when she saw Price. "Detective, I didn't expect to see you here." "Just paying my respects," Price said. Janet looked down at her daughter's grave. She would have been 31 years old this year. "I think about that sometimes. The life she never got to live, the person she never got to become." Price nodded. "I'm sorry we couldn't find her sooner." "You found her when it mattered most," Janet said softly. "When we needed to know. When we needed closure. Sometimes I think Emily waited until the right person came along. Someone who would listen to a little girl's drawing and take it seriously." They stood together in silence, two people connected by tragedy and the strange, unpredictable paths that lead to resolution. Before leaving, Janet placed a hand on Emily's headstone. "I like to think she's not really gone, and that some part of her is still here, watching over us, watching over Ferndale." Price thought about Kayla Brennan's drawing, and the girl standing in the trees, the impossible sighting that had cracked open a 15-year-old mystery. "Maybe she is," he said. Janet Miller smiled and walked away, leaving Price alone with the dead. He took one last look at the headstone, at the flowers carefully arranged, at the inscription that promised Emily would never be forgotten. Then he returned to his car and drove away from Ferndale, the town where a girl had vanished without a trace, only to be found 15 years later because a child had seen her standing in the trees. Some mysteries are solved through evidence and interrogation, through forensics and dogged determination. And some are solved because the dead refused to stay silent. Emily Miller's case was closed. Her killer was behind bars. Her family had found the answers they desperately needed. But on foggy mornings along Highway 52, if you drive slowly and look carefully toward the forest near the abandoned Hutchins farm, you might see her, standing among the trees, watching the road, waiting. A ghost made real by a child's innocent drawing, a girl who came home,